Thank you very much, and it is a pleasure for me to have this opportunity to participate at this seminar. I would like to thank IFES at Kyungnam University and Director Lee Kwan-Sei at IFES. I had the opportunity to listen into the earlier sessions, and it was very interesting. We heard about the DPRK politics, and I think it was helpful for me to understand the state of affairs in the DPRK. At the plenary, there was not a lot of mention about the international or inter-Korean aspect, but I think that we can be a little bit creative and talk about this year's outlook for DPRK's international and inter-Korean policies. Can we share my presentation materials?
어떻게 공유가 되었습니까?
Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. So
이걸 보면서 제가 말씀드리겠습니다. 역시 올해도 최고
I'm
한반도
going to refer to this. And
2009년부터 불안정한
the biggest, foremost leading area of interest in the 2022 Korean Peninsula state of affairs is this unstable stability that we've seen since 2019. We want to understand whether this is going to continue to change and become a nuclear crisis or become a virtuous cycle between the three countries of South Korea, North Korea, and the US, and maybe lead to end of war declaration and denuclearization. We've seen the Hanoi issue, and since then we've seen the New Way Christmas gift a la breakthrough. So now they have also tried to present a new calculation to the US. The US is continuing with the strategic patience. There is the Beijing Winter Olympics and Paralympics in February and March, and the continued COVID-19, the Korean presidential elections in May. All of these different variables mean that at least for the first half of 2022, that the DPRK is going to try to engage in risk management domestically and engage in strategic patience internationally. As for the US strategy, if you were to take a look at a few things, I think that right now, the DPRK stance against the US and South Korea is one of a strategic patience, and this is what I've been using since last year, that this kind of a strategic patience is going to continue. 2017, we saw the height of provocation, and in 2018 and 19, we saw the height of possible peace. There was the 4-No principle of nuclear weapons that the DPRK issued, and in 2019. In the New Year's address, they said that we're going to move towards a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, and this is our firm position that is never going to change. So this was around the time when we saw the height of possible peace in the Korean Peninsula. I think right now we're in the middle, halfway in the middle. What is unfortunate here is that this kind of, we're going to enter into new relations that is right for the new era. If this kind of precondition has been in place in the last few years, and I think that perhaps we could have maybe seen more progress on peace and denuclearization, but unfortunately that was not something that occurred. When I look at the DPRK nuclear issue, I have come to the conclusion that we cannot have denuclearization without a peace regime. This is the firm conclusion that I have. That we cannot have denuclearization without peace regime, and this is the situation that we find ourselves in. Early last year, and towards the end of 2 years ago, there was some provocation, and the US also had its strategic patience. Sanctions, containment, deterrence, and the DPRK was engaging in threats. And now that they have new information, they've been engaging in brinksmanship diplomacy. Many people thought that we're going to see a return to that, but I thought that that is going to be impossible given several factors, which is why I thought that the DPRK is going to engage in strategic patience. The reasons for that is because of COVID-19, we've seen how we're seeing this slumber or winter hibernation of international policy. This is something that is going to lead on into at least the first half of 2022, in which case it's not just important for us to come up with an outlook, but understand the reasons why. Because the DPRK has engaged in completing the nuclear capabilities, so they don't feel the need to try to demonstrate their capabilities. And there's also that check from China. Because of COVID-19, they cannot have dialogue with the US anyway, so that is why they felt no need for provocation. However, we were able to see that there was no strong or hard provocation, but they had some soft provocation instead, maybe with a few short-range missile tests. And I think that we will likely see the soft provocation happen again in 2022. I don't think that this situation is going to drastically change, especially because we have the new presidential election in Korea, and the Beijing Olympics in February. But I don't think that these events in and of themselves will bring about a huge turning point for the Korean Peninsula. I don't think that the DPRK is going to make any measurable or significant movement unless there's new calculation from the US, but also that if the Biden administration says that because they have made the gesture for dialogue to the DPRK, and if the Biden administration decides not to do anything and just waits, then we're going to see a prolonged kind of situation of the kind that we saw after Hanoi. And perhaps there could be a crisis situation in the second half of this year. I wouldn't say that there's a high likelihood, but maybe a sort of a mid-level likelihood. JPRK's nuclear deterrence strengthening has never been stalled once in the past. Over the last 2-3 years, in fact, the DPRK has been demonstrating its capabilities and its full potential. Of course, there were some restrictions made to their capabilities because they could not source the necessary materials and components, but we know that they have continued to demonstrate their capabilities and develop them. Right now, people say that they have about 50 nuclear weapons. They've been developing 5 a year, and this means by 2030, they will likely have about 100 nuclear weapons. And when that happens, then many people will come to see DPRK as a nuclear state because, and that will make it very impossible for us to demand denuclearization. In August of last year, the IAEA issued a report on the safeguards of the DPRK, and this allowed us to see that DPRK is going to continue on developing its nuclear weapons. What about nuclear tests, you might ask? Over the past 3 years, we've seen nuclear tests and we've seen suspension of tests of intermediate and long-range missiles, but I think that there was still ongoing development. This means that this will naturally lead to a demand for tests, scientific tests. So I think that maybe in the second half of this year, there might be some tests conducted, maybe not nuclear tests, but perhaps borderline tests such as mid-range missiles, some other different tests to try to express their frustration at the US. Recently, with the US actions, there is something that is quite significant. In July of last year, as you know, they submitted a voluntary national review of sustainability to the UN on UN SDGs. We all have been despairing, especially myself, back when I did the Cato project, because we were unable to have access to any statistics for the DPRK. But now we see that DPRK has voluntarily given these statistics to the UN. I don't think that this would have been possible without Kim Jong-un's approval. So I would like to say, this is my own opinion, but I think that Kim Jong-un revealed these statistics to try to become a normal state. And perhaps it wants to re-enter into international community and maybe possibly feel out cooperation with international financial organizations or different IOs, and maybe even get food. and welfare support from the international community. I think that maybe their idea of security is changing a little bit because once they have announced the completion of their nuclear capabilities, we've seen mention of different things that we were not able to see before. So, for example, in the past, they talk about ideological struggle or evil and etc. But we were not able to see that anymore. We see that there's more of a power struggle. In September, they say the stable management of Korean Peninsula. This is something that South Korea typically said, but the first time the DPRK has said. They also said that war is not South Korea, the US. Our enemy is not the US or Korea, but our enemy is war itself. This is falls under the concept of collective security. They talk about strategic balance, for example, and strategic stability, that South Korea is trying to break their strategic balance. These are all expressions that US or the ROK would use. So it's very significant that the DPRK is trying to use these different expressions and terminologies as well. So it looks like they're trying to reimagine their concept of security, that they want to try to maintain this regional strategic stability and power balance on the Korean Peninsula through their nuclear armament. And they're going to try to use that as a way to try to engage in cooperation and dialogue with the US and with Korea. I don't think that this is going to work, but I think that this might be the position that DPRK has in mind. Now, in this kind of situation, what should we do here in the ROK? Just briefly, about 1 minute, and I'll end.
남북 관계는 북한 핵 문제 해결에 대해서 가장 큰 우리의 난관 중에 하나는 다양한 북핵 협상.
One of the big obstacles that we have is that many people say that we should not have any negotiations with the DPRK because it's never going to work. There are people who are very fatalist regarding this. I think that these concepts are wrong because DPRK has successfully developed its nuclear weapons, but as we've said in the earlier sessions, I think that DPRK has failed in its state strategy. Kim Jong-un and his leadership have failed the state. So I think that if the price is right, that the DPRK would be willing to give up some portion of the nuclear weapons to maintain hold on some other areas. I think that the possibility is still there. And I think that our dialogue and maximum pressure have all failed because we have implemented them under a wrong strategy, miscalculated strategy. If we had done it correctly, because if we had been I think if we have been able to engage in a wrongful strategy in the past, this was not successful. Many people also say that the ball is in DPRK's court, that the DPRK has to make the first move. But I think that it's very difficult for the DPRK to make the first move right now, that the DPRK and the US must move together. But there is a stalemate right now. And for us to break through of the stalemate, I think that the best option is to have an interim agreement on the freezing of nuclear weapons and capabilities. And I think that possibly this could happen in the next 3 to 4 months, because we have many of the denuclearization measures that we've already put on the negotiation table. And if we can tie them in with corresponding measures from the US, then maybe we can have a possible interim agreement package. So I think that this is something that we should think about, because I think that the possibility, it's not easy, but I think that the doors are still open. 2 more things, if I can, is that we have to promote humanitarian assistance to North Korea. And of course, we have to do that with an eye to negotiations with the DPRK, but we also have to make use of IOs, regional organizations, and NGOs to be more effective. And on the end of war declaration, I think that it could be at the entrance to denuclearization. This is what the Korean administration is really focusing on. I support it, but I don't think it's going to be easy. This was something that Roh Moo-Hyun attempted to do in his administration, but many people are worried that it could hurt Chorus Alliance or about the standing of the USFK or UN Command. But because there is this idea that they're going to see some harm, they're going to suffer some harm. I think that the US also understands, the US also sees it that way, which means that maybe we can, at least the two Koreas can make the first move by entering into a kind of a framework agreement or a basic agreement that we can have a kind of interim agreement between the two Koreas through this framework agreement. And this is something that, of course, 30 years ago, we already signed. And also there is the relevant information contained in the Panmunjom Declaration. So if we can have all of these into a new framework or basic agreement, maybe we can also include some language about end of war declaration there. And this could be a way for us to find an important opportunity to try to go towards peace. And this is something that maybe we might be able to see even in the first half of this year, maybe, depending on the agenda that we place at the highest level. That is all. Thank you. Thank you for keeping to the time limit. The DPRK is not going to give up its nuclear weapons, and many people believe this idea very strongly. That is why the past nuclear policies have all failed. Dr. Jun says that that is not the case. Nuclear development may have been successful for the DPRK, but if the price is right, that the DPRK would come to the negotiating table. And this current situation will likely last until at least the first half of this year. So thank you very much.
Now, Dr. Lee Jung-Chul, may I ask you to provide your discussion briefly, if possible, for about 5 minutes? Professor Lee Jung-Chul, yes. Now, Professor Chun, in his paper, talked about how North Korea has gone back to the nuclear economy parallel pursuit. But I reserve my judgment about that. Now, whether North Korea has indeed gone back to nuclear economy parallel pursuit, I believe that it still remains a moot point. But then I also agree with the changes in the strategy in its security. And also, North Korea recently has mentioned that the US is not the main enemy and their main goal is to deter war. So I believe that that marks a very big change. And also at the Eighth Party Congress, even then, North Korea called the US the main enemy, but within 10 months' time, they changed the expression. So I believe that that is a noteworthy change. And also removing the term main enemy, now they have come up with the term double standard. So I believe that these changes go hand in hand in one package. At any rate, so I do agree with Professor Chan's conclusion. Biden administration just proposing dialogue and waiting and sitting around, thinking that it's done everything it could, then North Korea could give up on dialogue. It could move on to like military provocations or to weapon development. I also agree with this possibility. And then now you also cited some of the domestic political situation as the reasons, meaning that if the domestic political situation in North Korea were to worsen, then North Korea could go the way of provocation. But I think this could be a bit controversial. So some are saying that if the domestic political situation becomes worse, then they could succumb to sanctions. Some argue that, then some, like Professor Chun, is saying that it could actually lead to provocations. But then I believe that we have to put aside the domestic political situation. And then some are saying that North Korea will engage in strategic provocations all throughout the first half. But then now, in the recent media paper, the North Korea, they have also said that North Korea does not just subjugate itself to the environment and just be dominated by the environment. And they also say that we should not be just hung up on the uh, media reports that only have a few words. And so I believe that they show that North Korea continues to try to be proactive in their behavior or strategy. So I believe that just maintaining a strategic patience posture is probably not going to work. And last, I also agree with Professor Chan's assessment that US and North Korea are trying to throw the ball into each other's court. So I agree with that. But then now, who threw the ball to whose court? That is actually very important. And I believe that right now, North Korea has thrown the ball to our court. That is all from me. Thank you. Yes, thank you. So Professor Lee has said that he is in general agreement with Professor Chun's assessment, and he has mentioned just 3 or 4 points. So domestic political situation and also the strategic provocations, and also about the provocations to come in the first half. So just a few minor disagreements. So perhaps Professor Chun could respond to that later on.
Next, we'd like to hear from Professor Park Won-Gon, and then we can hear the final remarks from Dr. Jung. Maybe if you can restrict your comments to about 5 minutes. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. I listened well to Dr. Chun's presentation, and I have to say that I substantially agree with much of what he said, but I just want to stress some things for now, and maybe if time allows, I could be given a chance to speak later. But right now, I think that the DPRK stance, both domestically and internationally, is that we're seeing a little bit of a stronger radicalization since the Hanoi no deal ended. We've seen changes within the DPRK being impacted by externalities. And I think this has been mentioned in the first few sessions, but depending on how a reading of 2018 is, I think we can have different interpretations. I think that 2018 was not necessarily a big transition. And I think that the economic front was not completely maximized. I actually am of the belief that the Bong-Geun parallel policy was never completely destroyed. And this is why I believe that the definition of this was not really something that has changed. In 2019, that was when the DPRK started to split off mention of the nuclear development from the parallel policy. So I think that overall, we don't necessarily see this as a big transition, that this has been the same kind of a policy for the last 10 years. After 2019, after Hanoi, I think we've seen a big radicalization or maybe even a conservatism or a kind of radicalization, but I think that this is something that we are seeing in both domestic and international policy. At the plenary, we're seeing fewer mentions of socialism and etc. But I don't think that this means that the DPRK is going to do away with socialism, because it did talk about the importance of law and regulations, systems and institutions. So I think that this is still going to be important going forward. So as has been mentioned by another panelist, I think that we're going to see this emphasis on collectivism and patriotism, that this is going to be that we're going to see. I think that the DPRK is going to go into a mode of waiting it out, a kind of a patience until the US recognizes it as a nuclear state. But we don't know if the US is ever going to do that. I think that the DPRK is blocking its own exit because it is asking for the revocation of hostile policies. But I don't think the US is ever going to agree to this current state of affairs, which means that the DPRK has to wait this out. But I don't know how long it can wait. And I think that even within the DPRK, they're probably thinking about this issue. And as Dr. Lee Jung-Chul has already mentioned, I think that Kim Jong-un, the mention that he's saying that the enemy is not South Korea or US, that the enemy is war itself, this kind of speech that he gave is in line with our understanding of the double standards arguments that they are trying to say that they are justified in the pursuit of nuclear weapons. And this was also something that has been mentioned by Kim Yo-jong in September already. This is something that the DPRK has been newly emphasizing very strongly since then. With the arms race, I have to agree with what Dr. John said, that this discourse, I think, is something that the DPRK has shown, that in the past they are saying that we have no choice to develop nuclear weapons because we're under threat. But now, rather than taking a passive stance, the DPRK is taking a more active stance, a proactive stance, and saying that they are justified in their development of nuclear development, that there is a need for this. So this is something that they are going to incorporate into their justification discourse. If we were to do an outlook of 2022, I think that COVID-19 is also going to be the biggest variable. Even the DPRK leader himself has stated that this is a priority agenda for the DPRK. So if this is the case, what are they going to do? After the March presidential elections in the ROK, what is the DPRK going to do? I think that there are 5 things that the DPRK could do in terms of the brinkmanship policy. Oh, they will have to pressure the ROK administration and pressure the US, but they've also used up all their cards. They did the SLBM, so they don't have a lot of cards left. And also, they might try to carve out a space for themselves between US and China. Even if they were to launch an ICBM, I don't think that this is very, doesn't have a likelihood of happening. And with the economy, they would have to try to see some kind of a breakthrough out of the economic difficulty that they're seeing right now. The ROK US combined exercises in March could also be a kind of important moment. This means that there is still a likelihood that the DPRK is going to do a launch of ICBM or SLBM. And also, as mentioned by other panelists, what is the DPRK going to do for the 110th anniversary? I think that maybe there's going to be some kind of event revolving around ICBM, but even if there's no launch, I think they're going to do something to try to pressure a US somehow. I don't think Dr. John had the chance to talk about this because he didn't have the time, but I think the Biden administration is reverting back to strategic patience. EPRK has said no, rejected unconditional talks. And I think that the Biden administration is retreating to strategic patience because of that. And Biden wants a strategic or kind of a stable management of the Korean Peninsula. And if the DPRK were to engage in brinkmanship, I think that maybe the Biden administration could be a little bit more engaged in concessions. And I think that the DPRK could read that in their calculations. That is all. Yeah, Professor Park has given us a little bit of a different interpretation. Dr. Chun, before you respond, if I were to just introduce what has been mentioned in the earlier sessions in the session regarding the economy.
So then at the 8th plenary, now the 5-year economic plan, especially when they were looking back to the past year's achievement, then it appears as if they have changed the overall picture. And then now they cited the agricultural area as one example. So now then it appears as if that there are some changes that are detected in the, let's say, the approach or the time series. What this means is that for in North Korea's judgment, now the situation changing drastically for the better for North Korea is probably not likely, including the US situation. And then also given that the COVID-19 is prolonged and this is also making their economy difficult. Now then, for them to maintain the status quo, then they would have to focus more on agriculture for the sake of economic sustenance. So of course, agriculture has always been an important part for them, but now putting greater emphasis on it so that they can ensure people's livelihood and also to preserve the North Korean regime. So that appears to be the reason why they are focusing more on agriculture. Having said that, in the first half, there is not likely to be big changes in their basic stance. And also, it appears as if the view is that there are not going to be much changes coming out of North Korea or the US. And if so, given the situation that if the North Korea were to go into provocation, then what benefit will it gain? And also, the under the current circumstances, inside and outside, like COVID-19 and the external circumstances, will it be possible for North Korea to engage in any such types of provocations? So right now, that appears to be their only leeway. So of course, in the past, they had used brinksmanship in order to gain the upper hand in the nuclear dialogue, and also they have also had some try to have hard-handed tactics in order to push through their views. But then right now they probably will not work. So perhaps that is the reason why they are sticking to their plan for the 5-year economic development and also the weapon system development. So because at this time it would be difficult for them to seek any kind of transition. So from that perspective, then Professor Park's pressure or provocations, and then you also talked about the 5 possibilities. But then now perhaps they might be a bit different under the current circumstances from the past in turn in the patterns. And then now I would like to ask Professor Chun to respond to the discussions by Professors Lee Jung-Chul and Park Won-Gon.
예, 저는 몇 가지 좀 말씀드리겠습니다. 우선
I'm going to say a few more words regarding the nuclear issue.
우리 방 소장님께서 말씀하셨듯이
As the director has already mentioned,
모두 국내 위기 관리에 집중하고 있는 것 같아요.
right now the three countries, US, ROK, and the DPRK are focusing on domestic concerns.
이의를 제기하는
Well,
편입니다. 북한 핵 문제가 현재 50기,
for the DPRK nuclear
100기,
weapons, there are 50 right now. 10 years, there's going to be 100. This means that it's going to increase the cost of denuclearization. And so one of the options that we have right now is to focus more on our allies or develop our own nuclear weapons or spend all the money that we have to developing conventional capabilities. None of these will bring about the national consensus or positive public opinion. So we have to have denuclearization of the DPRK. But if we just wait, if the DPRK is focusing on strategic patients and the US is busy with domestic politics, so should we also sit around and wait? I think that's going to be a very mistaken policy in 10 years' time, because it's already been 30 years. 10 years is rather short, relatively speaking. Maybe later, 10 years down the road, DPRK is going to say that they want to be recognized as a nuclear state. And when they have 100 weapons, it's going to be more difficult to try to give them all up and go towards the path of denuclearization, which is why we have to work more proactively to try to bring the US and DPRK to the negotiation table so that we can have denuclearization. And regardless of nuclear armament, the DPRK, the worst case scenario within the case of containment is that they're going to see the massive famine that they saw in the 1990s. And so this is why they're focusing on the agriculture industry, because they want to see the 1990s as a precautionary tale. But I don't think that this is still going to be sustainable for the DPRK because they lack domestic internal resources. I think that domestically, their leadership knows that they have failed, which is why they want to engage in international cooperation or work more on ties with China or do something to climb themselves out of this hole, because under this current containment, this is not sustainable for the DPRK. And we have to make use of this opportunity. And if that is the case, right now DPRK can maybe last for a few more weeks, but I think that going forward, this could be very difficult for the DPRK. And as with all countries, the DPRK, instead of just succumbing to the situation, they will not go down without a fight, and they will do something to provoke the international community, which is why I'm saying that there could be a possible crisis in the second half of this year. Thank you. Thank you.
예, 저 미국이나
All right, thank you. So now both the US and North Korea, they would focus on the domestic governance, but then still South Korea has to be active in trying to improve the situation on the Korean Peninsula and then also to building peace. Now, Professors Park or Lee Jung-Chul, do you have anything further to add?
네.
If I can have just 1 minute. The key point that I wanted to say is that the DPRK regime, unless the US makes a more active position towards the DPRK, I think that the DPRK is going to become more radical. So that is the trend that we're seeing right now. I don't know where it's going to end or how it's going to end. It's difficult for us to know. With the ICBMs, as has been mentioned by the other panelists, I think that this is a little bit uncertain, but at least for military technology, they need to test the technology behind ICBM if they really want to deploy it. But can the ICBM really get through the missile defense system of the US? We still have our doubts about that. And another thing is that if they were to test the ICBM, the US would feel threatened in terms of their mainland protection, so they won't be very passive. And so we don't know how a US is going to respond to that, which is why I think that the DPRK's calculations are very complicated, but at least from the point of view of the DPRK, that, as Dr. Chon has said, fundamentally that they want to try to have kind of a one-on-one situation with the US, but unless they have that, they will not be able to do exactly, even if they have the ICBM card. I think that we now have a clear discussion, and because this also has implications for inter-Korean policies, I think that we can end the international session here. And because we're very much out of time, we'll move straight to the inter-Korean session. Thank you very much to Dr. Chun, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Park.
그러면은 대남 분야의 그 양무진.
Now then, I would like to ask Professor Yang Moo-Jin, also the Vice President of the University of North Korean Studies, to deliver his presentation for about 10-15 minutes on the North Korea's policy toward the South. Now, yes, I am Yang Moo-Jin. Now, under the belief that time is not on my side, let me be brief. Now, at the plenary meeting that was held in North Korea, so based on that, I would like to assess the South Korea policy in the first half and the outlook on the inter-Korea relations, and then what should be our response to that. Now, it was quite actually brief at the plenary. In other words, the South Korea policy was quite brief. And of course, still it made for analysis because there was at least a little bit. Again, it was brief, but then for the South Korea policy, we can see that there were direct and indirect comments. Now, direct commentary was about the principles and also the tactical direction. And the indirect commentary was more about the national military defense capability buildup. Now, as is already well known at the plenary this time, North Korea also came up with a subcommittee for external relations. They also had discussion and also came up with some deliverables. Despite that, for them to have only such a brief commentary on South Korea policy is, I believe, due to COVID-19. Now, North Korea, what it has revealed at the plenary, in other words, their principles in their approach to South Korea, now I believe that they come down to abolishment of the double standard and hostile policy. And also, what is the tactical direction mentioned by North Korea, meaning that they should be ready for both dialogue and confrontation. And depending on the environment and the circumstances, they're going to adjust the scale and the pace. And especially the tactical direction by North Korea. So this actually shows the variability of North Korea rather than the rigidity. Now, it was on the 5th of this month that they have fired the ultrasonic missile. And this also, I believe, shows that it is related to the direct and indirect. relations with the variable strategy by North Korea. So perhaps this was, on one hand, purely for the technological testing, just to test the developed missile. But also, on the other hand, it was also a pressure on South Korea to respond to its demands to abolish the double standards and the hostile policy. Now then, let me go into the outlook for the first half regarding North Korea, South Korea policy. Now, it is uncertain, but there is no cause for despair. Now, the Beijing Olympics could be the first testing stage to see where the inter-Korea relations are going to be headed. Now, of course, the North Korean Sports Ministry recently sent a letter to China that they will not be sending their athletes, but if North Korea were to send their government officials, then it could lead to some unexpected events. And also the presidential election to be held in March. And then now on May 11th, there is going to be a new government launched. And North Korea, so there are concerns that North Korea might go into a provocation in order to take the upper hand. Now then, let me go into the conclusion.
I think that the DPRK might maintain a restrained kind of attitude, and they're reserving a message to South Korea. But I think that this COVID-19 situation gets a little bit better, that perhaps this reservist attitude might transition to one that is open to dialogue. At the plenary, the DPRK did not once mention any escalation of nuclear capability. And it also did not have a lot of mention about military strength either. They mentioned it in a principled way to just reaffirm the past stance. And when it comes to international or South Korea or US approach, they try to be vague. And I think that they're trying to observe how the situation will play out. And they're trying to see what the situation is going to happen and try to carve out some room for themselves for what comes. When the peace process, have to continue on with the peace process. The key priorities that the DPRK has mentioned in the plenary, and if we here in the ROK has any priority areas that are a match with the DPRK's priorities, maybe we can start from there. That can be a starting point for us to engage in inter-Korean cooperative projects. So for rural or natural disaster management or health and welfare. There's the double standard or other different areas, and we can try to say that we can do away with hostile relations, and in exchange, maybe the provide more humanitarian assistance or health assistance, and this could lead to a cooperative attitude between the two. Time is not on our side, so if we move quickly, then perhaps we can have success, but if we have a longer postponement of this kind of stalemate, then perhaps it'll be difficult for us to go back to any positive kind of outcome. Thank you very much for sticking to your points in this very brief presentation. In looking at the first half of this year, you say that it's not all negative, that there is some scope for dialogue, but that the combined U.S. military, U.S. Iraq exercises and the new incoming Iraq administration could possibly be some catalyst for some kind of event or action on the parts of the DPRK. Now, I would like to hear from Dr. Choi Yong-Hwan from INSS, and then we'd like to hear from Zheng Ji-young of Center for Korean Studies at Fudan University.
Yes, hello, this is Choi Yong-Hwan from the Institute for National Security Strategy. Now, as was mentioned by Professor Yang and others, now at the latest plenary in North Korea, they only had one or two sentences on the South Korea policy. So yes, there were discussions, obviously, but then the fact that it was not mentioned outside. So then there were some questions about, is there any meaning to this at all? And then right after that, so on January 5th, the ultrasonic missile test firing, and what does this mean? So I believe that there have to be some more interpretation in these developments. Now, I don't really have any specific disagreements. It's just that looking into the North Korean situation today, then they are probably maintaining their head-on breakthrough stance. And the basis for this is that the China-US strategic competition will continue for some time. Then that means that North Korea will probably be moving ahead on its own. And then now for the short term, for North Korea and also for the US and South Korea, each country is very busy with their domestic circumstances. So for North Korea to preemptively present its own position, rather than doing that, they would have to wait and see. So they would also have to see the developments in the other major countries until they finalize their own position. So that was the stance at the plenary. And then some of the factors, important factors for this year, 2022, then again, of course, they are largely redundant with the others, but now there is the presidential election in March, which also coincides with the ROK-US joint exercise, because it was already announced that they're not going to delay the joint exercise. Now then, in March, there is both the presidential election as well as the joint exercise. What is North Korea to do? Now, for the joint exercise, I mean, they're not going to have any very strong provocation, but then they have never just let it pass. So we would have to see what will happen, what will come out of North Korea. Then also on May 11th, a new president will come into office. And then now there's also going to be a space projectile launch by South Korea. And I wonder how North Korea is also going to react to this. So I think last year when North Korea had kind of a scientist conference, they also talked about the right to peaceful use of the space. So you wonder what North Korea is going to do at that time. Then also another factor in the first half, I believe, is Beijing. So up until Beijing, I believe that until Beijing Olympics, China will remain low-key in their competition with the US. But after Beijing Olympics, I believe that it is going to change. So after the Beijing Olympics, it's likely that China will become more aggressive against the US. And again, this question is, what will North Korea do then? Now, given this, then 2022 and also throughout 2023, so for the short-term outlook, then there are not many structural factors that would bring about major changes on the Korean Peninsula, but then also thinking about the presidential election and also the midterm election in the US. And I would say that there are some challenges every now and then. And whether North Korea will fire ICBM or any types of projectile in that time, we would have to wait and see. But then it is highly likely that there would be some alarms or some cause for concern in terms of the situation management. And also right now, North Korea claims that there is no pandemic in North Korea, but now North Korea will have to reopen its borders at some time. So they cannot just keep their borders closed forever. But if COVID-19 will never go away, then North Korea also has to develop its immunity, meaning that they need outside help. When is going to be the timing of that? So that could perhaps going to be a different timing than the timing of the crisis that I mentioned earlier. And also another factor is now China. China, whether it also has immunity against Omicron variant. So whether China can withstand the pandemic just by closing off. And if China continues to move toward this the lockdown or closing off, then this could also affect the global supply chain, meaning that it could also lead to a China-triggered global economic crisis. So anyways, if that does happen, then it would also become more difficult for North Korea to reopen its borders. So what kind of decision will North Korea make at that time? Perhaps because of all these different circumstances and factors, it would be very difficult for North Korea to define or announce its position to the outside. Now, I have no differences from Professor Yang. It's just that I made a few comments of my own. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. So you have mentioned some of the factors that we have to keep in mind. And then he also talked about the possible developments after the occurrence of such factors. So on one hand, the COVID-19 and also, so we see that particularly the COVID-19, now for better or worse, it is bound to lead to other situations. So for example, if North Korean borders remain closed, then also the perhaps potential crisis in the global supply chain, which also could be a crisis of security. So the topics that we're discussing now, and from these topics, other situations or problems could arise, then how are we going to prevent, or how are we going to identify the potential circumstances arising from the current situation at hand? So of course, it's not easy to predict, but also they're not just issues that we should let pass.
소장
Lastly, we'd like to hear from Professor Zhang Jiyong from Fudan University, who is going to give us the Chinese perspective. I know the Fudan University is engaging in a lot of exchange with North Korea, so we'd like to hear the Chinese perspective from Professor Zhang. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this seminar. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to be as brief as possible. I have divided my points into three areas. The first is that the domestic situation with the DPRK is very serious. This is the conclusion that we can reach. Some of the keywords here is that there's zero openness, and because of that, there's zero confirmed cases of COVID-19. But this also means that there's zero exchange with the outside world. And because of that, the internal domestic situation is very severe for the DPRK. And under that, the first is that disease control and domestic economy and the livelihood of the people, these are big dilemmas for the regime. Right now, they are trying to focus on disease control and providing a social safety net for the people, but achieving this is very difficult for the regime. And as Dr. Yang has said, that the DPRK right now is really struggling right now. The DPRK has attempted to try to open the borders, but because of the number of confirmed patients in China, they were quick to close the border again. So this has continued to happen. And they have not been able to try to use technology to solve disease control and having more increased livelihood of the people. Right now, they have been receiving some assistance from China in the form of food aid, and this has been enough for North Korea to stay afloat, but it's not enough, and it's a matter of time. The other thing is that the DPRK right now is trying to decide what kind of signals that they're going to send to the outside world, because right now they have the two massive challenges, as I mentioned before, the overcoming COVID and trying to make use of the US-China relations to try to achieve and acquire their own national interests. And this is what the DPRK is trying to focus on at the moment. This is the twin challenges for the DPRK. Again, to overcome COVID and to make use of US-China relations. And what the DPRK needs now is try to cancel the hostile policies of the US and try to downsize Rocky West combined military exercises, but they are not able to do that right now, which is why the DPRK is remaining in the shadows, not really doing much. The only thing that they have done in terms of international outreach is to send an envoy or an ambassador to China and also do the testing of the hypersonic missiles. And the third thing that I want to mention is that there is a new image of Kim Jong-un's DPRK. These are the three keywords that I wanted to mention. One is the stabilization of the DPRK regime and to try to make a more efficient regime, make the regime stronger. And thirdly, to try to renew the Kim Jong-un brand, to try to justify its power and its rule over the regime. And also they are emphasizing and distinguishing Kim Jong-un from his father and great-grandfather. And that's how Kim Jong-un is trying to distinguish himself from his forebears, to try to focusing on people first, for example. And right now, Kim Jong-un is trying to demonstrate his authority by, for example, switching out to the leadership with a younger generation, and also trying to demonstrate the confidence of the regime, confidence in the regime. To try to solidify the standing of DPRK under Kim Jong-un's leadership. So this is evident by using the portraits of Kim Jong-un, for example, and also having these changes in the official position and the official duties within the regime. And the second keyword that I wanted to mention is the end of war declaration. We can look at the conditions, the attitude, and the response from the DPRK. DPRK's preconditions is the U.S. hostile policy, that the U.S. retreats its hostile policy, and also we try to clarify the concept of security among three countries so that we can have a simultaneous presentation of the concept of security for the two Koreas and for the U.S., that the DPRK wants a single uniform criteria to be applied into all of their understanding of security. And secondly is DPRK's attitude. Right now, I think that DPRK wants to hear more than just words. They want to hear action. Only when there is actual action can the DPRK decide to move, and they need to have that kind of authorization from the US. And as for response, they've tested the hypersonic missiles to try to show how frustrated they are, and because they won't be participating in the Winter Olympics in China, this means there's a temporary suspension of their engagement in international relations. So this is what we were able to see. Third, on the future outlook, just briefly, we can talk about three things. The first is that the nuclear issue would really come down to the preconditions and the key challenges. The nuclear issue is not something that we should focus on. The DPRK wants to focus more on peace and denuclearization overall, kind of a big picture. That the US and Korea have been focusing too much on the nuclear weapons side, so the DPRK wants to place the focus somewhere else. Second thing is that because of COVID, the DPRK has been isolated, and they might have acquired some methods of survival in the state of isolation. And they could find a way to try to increase and enhance the livelihood of the people in this current situation. And they might be able to confidently overcome the situation under the guise of self-sufficiency. And so they could package that in the future and show more of a confidence. Thirdly is that DPRK could possibly engage in a very precise diplomatic maneuvers to try to make use of the current US-China rivalry and to try to maximize their national interests in this current situation. Its basic framework against South Korea is to try to leverage South Korea to find a way to make use of the US-China rivalry to pursue their own national interests. And this is my discussion on Dr. Yang's presentation. Thank you. Yes, Professor Zhang, in the end, he talks about three interesting points: that the nuclear issue could possibly become a kind of a normal issue or a partial issue, depending on the preconditions or the key challenges. And secondly, that because of COVID-19 and the long, strong sanctions, DPRK has tried to overcome the current challenges, and maybe they might have stumbled upon new survival tactics. And Dr. Zheng has said something similar, that COVID-19 has put DPRK in isolation mode, but they might have been able to find a way to survive, to try to enhance the livelihood of its people. And thirdly, that the DPRK can engage in precise diplomatic tactics to try to make use of the US-China rivalry, that they will also leverage South Korea and leverage the other surrounding situations to try to maximize their national interests. So these are very important points that have been mentioned.
대략 끝났고요.
So now we are almost coming to the end. Now we have heard from the discussants, Choi Yong-Hwan and Jung Ji-Yong, but then they didn't really disagree with Professor Yang's presentation. They more or less added their commentary. Now then, Dr. Chun Bong-Geun or Lee Jun-Chul or Park Won-Gon. So I wonder whether you have any further comments or questions on this session's presentation. Are you all still with us? Yes, I'm still here. So if you have any questions or comments. Well, if you could elaborate a bit more about how they are looking for new approaches. You mean new approaches to address people's livelihood issue? Is that the one? Yes. Then Professor Jung Ji-Yong, so the three things that you mentioned, then the second topic, if you could elaborate a bit more about that.
Well, for instance, because of border closures, they have actually gone into an extreme isolation mode, even more so than when they were just impacted by sanctions. They've gone through the sanctions and survived, but they've also gone through an even more of an extreme situation. But maybe they have stumbled upon better survival tactics. And this could manifest itself on its maneuvers against the US or against China, against South Korea. This is what I try to say in my discussion, that they might revert to a more heightened level of survival tactics. I don't know if Dr. Lee would be satisfied with that. I have one more question. Recently in Korea, Chinese ambassador in the DPRK, he returned to China. I understand that he did not meet Kim Jong-un before he left. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also in November, I understand that China at the time, because of COVID-19, the DPRK tried to open the borders, but China was the one that said they don't want to do that. This maybe hints at some conflict between the DPRK and China, that they're maybe not be having a lot of dialogue. Can you tell us about that? I think for the DPRK, we see similar news like that the DPRK is going to open its borders, especially the northern or northeast regions. But because of Omicron, North Korea tried to do that, but they could not. The disease control measures have become stronger since June. So DPRK tried to make some attempts using technology, install booths and stuff, and try to protect the containers and their customs entry, and try to protect the people and the personnel. But there is a very low awareness level of the virus in the DPRK, so this was not easy to do. I don't think there is a lack of dialogue at the high level. China wants a reform from DPRK, especially the Northeast region. So because the Chinese merchants have continuously asked for the DPRK borders to open, but because of COVID-19, because of the concerns surrounding COVID-19, I think that that's the reason why this didn't happen. I don't think there is an issue between China and the DPRK.
또 다른 뭐 말씀 안 계신가요?
Any further comments or questions? Well, then, if I may as well.
지금 말씀을 들어보면
Now then, listening to the discussion so far, then it appears as if North Korea thinks that it can still take this under the current circumstances. Now, of course, North Korea has always been pursuing like self-reliant economy, and we all thought that that was just a myth. But then now, so today, almost with zero external exchanges, so under this lockdown, North Korea has found its way of survival. Now, of course, that there would be only limited production in North Korea, but then now they have the like chemical industry or petrochemical industry. So for them to do them on their own, then they would be quite inefficient. And there's no foreign currency coming in, and also no foreign transactions. They cannot import fuel or materials. How is this possible? How is it possible for North Korea to stand on its own? So we always thought that North Korea would need outside help. So South Korea is willing to provide support, or North Korea will go into provocations. And provocations, we always talked about how it is because things inside are quite in trouble. But now, under this, let's say, border closure, North Korea appears to be doing well. But then now, common sense says that that would be very difficult. So I wonder how that is possible. So is this also a question to me as well? Yes, Professor Jang Ji-yong, then again, North Korea under the COVID-19 and also under economic sanctions, quite long drawn out. So it appears as if it would be very challenging for North Korea. So there would be limits to how much North Korea can withstand. But then, Professor Chung, you seem to say that it is not so tough in North Korea, so it's very difficult to understand.
I think with that issue, people who know DPRK very well could easily understand that the DPRK right now looks like it's has shut down its borders vis-a-vis China, but it has not stopped the flow of all goods. So I think that there are some back channels to allow for the flow of goods. So maybe these necessary goods or basic supplies for the people have been able to go back and forth across the border from China. And I don't think that that has been especially problematic. I don't know exactly how long it's been, but so through different delivery means, maybe by ship, for example, some goods have been supplied to DPRK, and there was about a time lag of about 1 month, and then later there was also some more supply of goods that was provided to the DPRK, maybe this time by train. So I think that there is actually a flow of goods between China and the DPRK, although the borders may be closed for people-to-people exchange. So I actually think that the livelihood of the people is not as worse, as bad as what's been reported in the media. I think that we should have a sit down and have a more of a close talk. We've had a discussion since 1:30 with the fourth plenary of the 8th Central Committee of the Workers' Party. We've had discussions on North Korea's state of affairs, looking at its politics, its military economy, international, inter-Korean aspect. This has allowed us a good understanding of brief understanding of North Korea's state of affairs, and also some outlook about what might be happening this year. Some have said that the first half of this year, perhaps this kind of negative kind of situation would continue for the first half, and maybe the combined ROK-US military exercises could be a critical point. But overall, perhaps this kind of current situation is going to maintain itself for the first half because of COVID-19 and because of different sanctions, that it might not be easy for us to see a very big change. But if we continue to see the stalemate, this is not also going to be good for us either. So we have to try to identify some measures that we can engage in before things get worse, maybe try to exert some positive pressure to head towards the desirable direction for it. I think that this is what we have discussed, and we've talked about very local measures on different sections across the DPRK. This has been helpful for us and very informative. IFES Kyungnam University is going to upload your presentations and discussions to our official website. And for everyone who has not been able to come to our Zoom session today, you will have access to these materials and to the entire discussion on our official website and also on the website of Kyungnam University. I would like to thank all of our panelists and experts who have been with us until the very end. Of course, Professor Zhang Huizi from Jilin University, who's joined us from China, from Fudan University, Professor Zheng Jiyong, and Professor Hirai Hisashi of IFES Kyungnam University. Thank you very much for sharing with us your expertise. Thank you for your attendance here. I would like to once again thank all of our experts for attending today. And this has been North Korea State of Affairs 2021 Review and 2022 Outlook, and we'll now close this forum. Thank you.